The biting, horizontal mist of Pyeongchang swallowed the mountain estate, plunging the Museum of Isolation into a heavy silence as the power grid hissed and died. For Niall Carter, darkness was predator's weight. She wasn't just a groundskeeper tonight. She was a disposable shadow, fleeing the toxic dominance of Marcus Hale, whose jagged vibration of a voice echoed through the service tunnels behind her. Driven by a bone-deep terror, Niall broke the cardinal rule of her employment and burst through the forbidden mahogany doors of the master wing. She didn't find a savior. She found the sovereign, Shim Dukhyung, standing in the amber glow of the dying generators. He was a total stranger with steel-gray eyes and hard edges that looked carved from stone. Without thinking, Niall threw herself into his personal space, her trembling fingers clutching his charcoal sweater as she sought a sanctuary she hadn't earned. "Please," she gasped, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence fractured by panic. "There are men in the tunnels. I have nowhere else to go, just for tonight. Protect me." The sovereign went rigid, his muscles tensing like coiled steel beneath her touch. He didn't know this woman's name, but as he looked down at the broken stranger in his arms, he saw a miracle of resilience that mirrored his own hidden scars. His arms came around her slowly, deliberately, a wall of controlled violence that signaled the end of her life as a ghost. "No one will hurt you anymore," he rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that cut through the sub-zero air. In that shattering moment, the sovereign issued a surgical decree. This woman was now under his military precision of protection, and any insult to her would be treated as a personal strike against his silent throne. The master suite was a museum of isolation, a vault of glass and polished stone that usually vibrated with the mechanical precision of Shim Dukhyung's absolute control. Now, that control was a shattering moment of the past, replaced by the heavy silence of a blackout that felt like a burial. Dukhyung stood rigid, his steel-gray eyes locked on the broken stranger trembling against his chest. He could feel the jagged vibrations of Niall's heart hammering against his ribs, a rhythm of pure terror that didn't belong to an assassin, for an assassin would be cold, while she was a bone-deep chill of desperation. Gently, with a military precision that brooked no argument, Dukhyung peeled her fingers from his charcoal sweater and repositioned her behind his frame, transforming his body into a surgical shield. "Stay behind me," he rumbled, his voice steadying the air as he reached for the silhouette of hard edges that was the weapon in his hidden holster. He wasn't looking for a groundskeeper. He was looking for the shadows and heavy secrets that had followed her into his sanctuary. He moved to the master console, tapping the manual override to bring a faint, amber glow to the secondary reserve. His jaw tightened as the diagnostics scrolled. The master wing was supposed to be a hardened sanctuary, protected by independent internal alarms designed to trigger the moment a breach occurred. But the display remained stubbornly green, even as the perimeter sensors showed they were looped. The military precision he prided himself on had been compromised from within. The internal alarms hadn't failed. They had been surgically silenced by someone with deep-level access. "Who is Marcus?" he asked, his lethal clarity cutting through Niall's panicked breathing as he realized the breach was a coordinated strike involving an insider. Niall stepped back, her trembling fingers catching on a marble pedestal. "He was everything I ran from," she whispered, her voice fractured by bone-deep exhaustion. "He never lets go. I thought I'd be unencumbered here, but he found me." Dukhyung's mask cracked for a microsecond as he looked at her, seeing the material evidence of her trauma. He realized then that Marcus wasn't just a jilted ex. He was a tactical distraction being used by a traitor to bypass the house's mechanical precision. Suddenly, a camera feed flickered to life, showing a silent procession of tactical men moving with a surgical lack of sound. They were evaluating prey, and Dukhyung knew the grid of cold diamonds, reflecting their move was being controlled by one of his own. "They aren't here for you, Niall," he murmured, his hand settling on her shoulder with a possessive and protective weight. He was no longer looking at a maid, but a partner in a noir survival. "My own house is watching us through a hacked system. To survive, we have to become the shadows they can't track." The Museum of Isolation had transformed. What was once a sanctuary of hollow luxury and mechanical precision had become a concrete canyon of jagged shadows and lethal dead ends. As the amber light of the secondary console died, Shim Du-kyung stood in the total, heavy silence of the master's suite, his steel-gray eyes adjusting to the dark with the lethal clarity of a man who had lived his life preparing for the end of the world. Beside him, Niall Carter was no longer just a disposable ghost in a groundskeeper's uniform. She was the only person who understood the shadows and heavy secrets of the estate's hidden architecture. "The elevators are death traps," Du-kyung murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to steady the very air in the room. "If they have the smart tech loop, they'll drop the cars the moment we step inside." He looked at the heavy mahogany doors, knowing that the silent procession of men in tactical gear was already sweeping the main corridors with military precision. Niall's trembling fingers found the hem of her jacket, but her eyes remained fixed on a nondescript wood panel behind the sovereign's massive desk. "The service tunnels," she whispered, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence that belied the bone-deep terror vibrating through her frame. "They aren't connected to the central grid. No thermal sensors, no motion loops. I've spent months cleaning them while the rest of the house was unencumbered by my presence. I know the way out, but it's narrow. It's a surgical cut through the heart of the mountain." Du-kyung didn't hesitate. He grabbed a compact tactical light from his desk, his movements a silhouette of hard edges. "Lead," he commanded. It was a shattering moment for the sovereign. For the first time in a decade, he was no longer the one giving the map. He was the one following. Niall pressed a hidden release, and the panel slid back with a harsh, jagged laugh of grinding stone. They stepped into a world of raw concrete and biting, horizontal mist that leaked in from the external vents. This was the grid of cold diamonds from a different perspective, the skeletal remains of the estate that the hollow luxury of the upper floors sought to hide. The air was thin, smelling of salt-heavy dampness and stale grease. As they moved, the sounds of the siege echoed through the vents, the sudden and terrifying, muffled thuds of flashbangs, and the mechanical precision of breaching charges echoing like thunder in a concrete canyon. Du-kyung moved behind her, a wall of controlled violence that Niall could feel even without touching. He kept his hand fractionally close to her shoulder, a possessive and protective gesture that served as his only way of anchoring them both in the dark. "Left at the junction," Niall breathed, her military precision in the tunnels surprising even herself. "There's a crawl space that leads to the boiler room. From there, we can bypass the smart tech hubs and reach the lower garage." Du-kyung's steel-gray eyes scanned the ceiling, his lethal intensity focused on the vibrations above. He realized that Niall was right. The invaders were sweeping the museum of isolation above, hunting for the sovereign in his silent throne, never suspecting that the disposable shadow they had used as bait was now the one orchestrating his escape. The tunnel narrowed, the walls pressing in until Du-kyung's broad shoulders brushed against the cold, weeping concrete. He felt a bone-deep chill of vulnerability he hadn't experienced since he was a broken stranger himself, years ago. He looked at Niall, her auburn hair catching the faint light of his torch as she navigated the shattering maze with a soaring sense of achievement that cut through her fear. "You're not what I expected," he rumbled softly, his voice echoing in the narrow space. Niall stopped for a second, her trembling fingers tracing the latch of the next bulkhead. "A groundskeeper isn't supposed to know how to hide a sovereign, Mr. Shim, but when you spend your life being a disposable ghost, you learn where the shadows are deepest." The realization hit Du-kyung like a surgical, necessary cut. He had spent his life confusing being busy with being effective, building an empire of shadows, while this woman had been building the resilience to survive them. As they reached the final ladder leading to the lower depths, the sounds of the hit squad grew louder, their military precision finally catching up to the service hub. "The boiler room is next," Niall whispered, her eyes locking onto him with lethal clarity. "But once we cross that threshold, we aren't just hiding anymore. We're fighting." Du-kyung checked his weapon, his stony and impassive mask settling back into place. But this time, he ensured he was standing exactly where Niall could see him, a fortress of light in the middle of a shattering darkness. The boiler room was a brutalist sanctuary of heavy secrets, a labyrinth of thrumming pipes and concrete canyons that smelled of oil and the salt-heavy dampness of the mountain. Niall led Shim Dukhyung toward a reinforced bulkhead hidden behind a massive ventilation unit, a manual lock bunker designed for the estate's staff during the biting, horizontal mist of Pyeongchang's winter storms. As the steel door sealed shut with a lethal clarity, the chaotic sounds of the siege, the sudden and terrifying thuds of tactical boots, and the mechanical precision of the hit squad faded into a distant, muffled vibration. Inside, the bunker was lit only by the amber glow of emergency lanterns. It was a space defined by simplicity, a stark contrast to the hollow luxury of the Museum of Isolation above. Niall's trembling fingers finally stilled as she moved toward a small kitchenette meant for long shifts. With the military precision of a woman used to finding comfort in the shadows, she began to prepare a pot of oolong tea. The melodic, soothing cadence of the water beginning to simmer was the only sound in the heavy, contemplative silence that settled between them. Dukhyung sat on a narrow wooden bench, his silhouette of hard edges looking out of place in the modest room. He had placed his weapon on the table, the cold metal reflecting the flickering light. He watched Niall with steel-gray eyes, noting how she handled the tea set with a quiet, breathtaking dignity that made his own material evidence of success feel like a surgical shield he no longer wanted to carry. "I spent 10 years building that house," Dukhyung rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that lacked its usual stony and impassive mask. "I told myself it was a fortress. I filled it with smart tech and surgical defenses to prove I was unencumbered by the world." He looked around the small, utilitarian bunker. "But sitting here, I realize my empire is nothing more than a monument to my isolation. I've spent my life confusing being busy with being effective. And yet, a groundskeeper I didn't even know the name of is the only reason I'm still breathing." Niall set a steaming cup before him, her auburn hair catching the amber glow as she sat across from the man she had only known as a sovereign on a silent throne. "You didn't build a fortress, Mr. Shim," she said softly, her voice no longer a jagged vibration of fear but a steady resonance. "You built a cage. You thought that by keeping everyone at a surgical distance, you were safe. But distance isn't safety. It's just a different way of being a disposable ghost." The realization hit Dukhyung like a bone-deep chill. He reached for the tea, the warmth of the cup seeping into his lethal intensity and softening it. For the first time, the sovereign wasn't looking at the blood business or the surgical cuts required to stay on top. He was looking at the miracle of a woman who had been running from the only legacy that actually mattered, the simple, uncomplicated humanity of another person. "Marcus didn't just find me," Niall continued, her eyes locking onto his with lethal clarity. "He knew I'd come here. He knew I'd look for the most isolated place on the map because that's what I do. I hide. I've lived my life in constant survival mode, and it made me predictable. I'm the surgical weakness in your wall, aren't I?" Dukhyung didn't argue. He took a slow sip of the tea, the heavy, contemplative silence returning, but this time it was shared rather than solitary. "We both built walls, Niall," he admitted. "Yours was made of shadows and mine was made of concrete canyons. But tonight the walls fell down." He looked at her, and for the first time he saw her not as a disposable shadow, but as a person worth protecting. "This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about deciding what kind of life is worth surviving for." As the biting wind of the mountain howled outside the bunker's vents, the tiger and the ghost sat together in the warm yellow light, two broken strangers finding a fortress of light in the one place they never expected, each other's presence. The tea in the ceramic cups had long since gone cold, but the heavy, contemplative silence within the bunker remained thick, pressing against the stone walls like a living thing. Shim Dukhyung sat with his large hands wrapped around the base of his cup, his steel-gray eyes fixed on a tablet displaying the estate's internal schematic. The screen flickered with an amber glow, revealing a jagged fracture in his military precision that he hadn't seen coming. "I spent millions on digital encryption and smart tech that I thought made this house unbreachable," Dukhyung rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He turned the screen toward Niall, the light reflecting off the hard edges of his face. But a fortress is only as strong as the people who hold the keys. My enemies didn't just find a signature, they found a ghost inside my own machine. The real betrayal wasn't merely Marcus Hale's obsessive tracking of Niall's behavior. As Du Kaiyang scrolled through the logs, he revealed a surgical overlap. Marcus had been funneling Niall's predictable panic patterns to a compromised member of Du Kaiyang's own security detail, a lieutenant who knew exactly how to loop the sensors in the master wing. Marcus hadn't just studied her. He had served as the psychological navigation system for an insider who knew the estate's mechanical precision from the inside out. Marcus didn't just trigger you, Du Kaiyang said, his stony and impassive mask cracking to reveal a bone-deep fury. He synchronized with someone I trusted. They used your chronic hypervigilance to ensure that when the power went out, you would run toward the one door my own security had secretly unlatched. The realization hit Niall like a surgical, necessary cut. She wasn't just a disposable ghost being hunted by an ex. She was the unintentional tool used by an internal traitor to bypass the sovereign. Lethal intensity. Her fear hadn't just been a byproduct of the chase. It was the specific key required to make the internal breach look like a frantic accident. "I brought the traitor right to your door," she whispered, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence fractured by guilt. Du Kaiyang stood, moving around the table until he was close enough that Niall could feel the coiled steel of his presence. He didn't look at her with blame. He looked at her with a possessive and protective resolve. "The traitor assumes I am still relying on a compromised system," he murmured. His fingers warm and sure against her skin. "They think they've mapped my blind spots through your trauma. But tonight, we aren't hiding in the shadows they've corrupted. We are going to use their own arrogance against them." The amber glow of the bunker's emergency monitors cast long, predatory shadows against the reinforced concrete, making the space feel less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of isolation, buried beneath the mountain. Shim Du Kaiyang stood motionless, staring at the behavioral heat maps that detailed Niall's every movement, every flinch, and every desperate attempt to remain a disposable shadow. The lethal clarity of the situation was a surgical, necessary cut to his ego. He had prided himself on his mechanical precision and his ability to see every move on the board, yet he had been blind to the most uncomplicated human factor, a traitor within his own ranks. His blood business was no longer just about territorial disputes or shipping manifests. It had evolved into a shattering moment where he realized his world had turned a woman's bone-deep trauma into a tactical tool for his own erasure. The revelation that Marcus Hale had been synchronized with one of his own security lieutenants turned his lethal intensity into a cold, focused fire. He realized that his isolation had made him the most predictable target of all, but that predictability ended tonight. "I built this empire on the idea that success requires commitment beyond feelings," Du Kaiyang rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to fill the small room with a heavy, contemplative silence. He looked at his hands, scarred knuckles that had enforced the hollow luxury of his silent throne, and felt the bone-deep chill of a man who had finally realized his material evidence of success was a monument to his isolation. He had treated his life like a grid of cold diamonds, beautiful and hard, but entirely devoid of warmth. Now, knowing that Marcus had sold Niall's chronic hypervigilance to a traitor inside his house, he understood that his blood business possessed no blood loyalty. He turned back to the terminal, his trembling fingers becoming warm and sure as he began to input a series of countercommands. If the traitor believed the sensors were looped and the internal alarms were silenced, Du Kaiyang would let them keep believing it. He would use their own arrogance as a surgical trap. He began to reroute the estate's internal power, not to restore light, but to prime the very smart tech systems the invaders thought they controlled. Niall sat across from him, her eyes locking onto his steel-gray eyes with a lethal clarity of her own. She realized she wasn't safe now, as he had promised. She had simply traded the toxic dominance of Marcus for the lethal intensity of Du Kaiyang's world. This estate, with its smart tech and military precision, was just a different kind of cage, a more expensive one filled with hollow luxury, but a cage nonetheless. "You said I was safe," Niall whispered, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence, fractured by the heavy secrets of the house pressing in on her. "But how can I be safe in a house where your own men use my fear to find you? How can I be safe with a man whose existence turns my trauma into a surgical weakness?" She had spent her life as a ghost in her own life, and she realized that even here, under the 3 powerful Ps of the sovereign, she was still just a piece on someone else's board. Du Kaiyang moved toward her, his silhouette of hard edges softening as he knelt before her, a possessive and protective gesture that lacked his usual, stony and impassive mask. "You're right," he admitted, the unworthy truth hanging in the air like a biting wind. "I promised you a sanctuary, but I gave you a battlefield. I've lived in constant survival mode for so long that I forgot what it meant to actually protect something instead of just owning it." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, giving her the unencumbered space he had previously denied her. "The traitor assumes I am still relying on a compromised system," he murmured. "They think they've mapped my blind spots through your trauma. But tonight, we are going to change the pattern. We are going to use their own arrogance to show them what happens when a sovereign has something worth protecting." The hollow sovereign realization was complete. He saw that his power was a suicide mission, and that the only miracle worth fighting for was the uncomplicated humanity he saw in the woman before him. Niall looked at him, seeing the broken stranger beneath the sovereign, and for the first time, she didn't want to run. But the cage was still there, and as the sudden and terrifying sound of a breach echoed through the vents, they both knew that the surgical cut of the night was only beginning. The heavy silence of the bunker was shattered by a sudden and terrifying vibration that felt as though the mountain itself were being torn apart. The Master Wing's external breach had finally occurred. A mechanical precision of high-grade explosives that signaled the hit squad had grown tired of playing with shadows and heavy secrets. Shim Du Kaiyang stood instantly, his stony and impassive mask settling back into place as he checked the cold metal of his weapon, but his eyes remained on Niall. He saw the bone-deep exhaustion in her face, the way she had been living in constant survival mode since she burst into his room, and for a shattering moment, he expected her to retreat into the deepest corner of the concrete canyon. "Stay here," the sovereign commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration intended to be a surgical shield. "The internal door is reinforced. They will have to burn through it, and by then my backup will be at the perimeter." But Niall didn't move toward the back of the bunker. Instead, she stood, her trembling fingers tightening around the heavy iron fire poker she had pulled from the hearth. The melodic, soothing cadence of her voice was gone, replaced by a lethal clarity that made her look like a stranger even to herself. "They are using the smart tech to find us, but they don't know the bones of this house, Du Kaiyang," she said, using his name for the first time without the unworthy stutter of a servant. "If you stay here, they will trap you in this museum of isolation like a disposable ghost. But I know how to turn the air against them." She realized at that moment that she could no longer afford to be a disposable shadow, waiting for a physical embrace of safety. If she was truly in a different kind of cage, then she would be the one to choose which bars to break. With military precision born of months of meticulous groundskeeping, she led him back toward the service hatch. She didn't lead him toward the guns. She led him toward the grid of cold diamonds that was the estate's climate control and industrial ventilation system. As they emerged into the maintenance hub, Niall bypassed the environmental misting controls. She knew that tactical visors could eventually adjust to simple fog, but they could not protect against the surgical reality of industrial groundskeeping chemicals and scalding heat. "They are tracking thermal signatures," she whispered, her eyes glowing with lethal intensity in the dark. "If I flood the vents with pressurized steam from the boiler and the alkaline fertilizers I use for the terrace, it won't just block their vision. It will sear their skin and blind their eyes, visors or not." Du Kaiyang watched her, a bone-deep respect replacing his possessive and protective instinct. He realized he had been confusing being busy with being effective by relying on technology, while Niall was using the very environment that had once been her suicide mission to dismantle a professional hit squad. With a surgical pull of a lever, Niall opened the high-pressure release valves. A A sudden and terrifying hiss filled the corridors as scalding, chemical-laden steam roared into the master wing above them. The sounds of the siege changed instantly. The military precision of the hit squad's footsteps became a jagged vibration of agony and harsh, jagged laughs of frustration as the caustic air bypassed their smart tech filters. Niall didn't stop. She navigated the concrete canyons of the service ducts, herding the invaders toward the glass-walled terrace where the concentration of steam was highest. She was no longer the prey. She was the architect of their shattering moment. "Now," she breathed, her hand hovering over the final release. Du Kaiyang stepped forward, his silhouette of hard edges appearing like a miracle out of the chaos. With the lethal clarity of a sovereign reclaiming his throne, he engaged the remaining intruders who were now broken strangers in a house they thought they had mapped. Niall stood in the shadows, no longer hiding from Marcus or the world, but standing as the fortress of light that held the house together. She had stopped being the girl who needed to be told, "You're safe now," and became the woman who ensured that the sovereign finally was. The mist Niall had unleashed acted as a shattering haze, but it was the sudden and terrifying introduction of caustic, pressurized steam that turned the Museum of Isolation into a tactical graveyard. Shim Du Kaiyang moved through the scalding clouds with lethal intensity, his silhouette of hard edges appearing and vanishing like a disposable ghost as he neutralized the disoriented invaders. However, the military precision he relied upon was compromised by the very chaos they had created. As the last of the Soul faction fell, a sudden and terrifying flash of steel cut through the biting, horizontal mist, and the sovereign let out a choked gasp as a blade found a gap in his guard. Surgical, necessary cut that sent him reeling against a marble pillar. Niall emerged from the shadows of the ventilation hub, her trembling fingers tightening around the iron poker as she saw the sovereign collapse. Blood, dark and lethal and immovable, bloomed across his charcoal sweater, stark against the bone-deep chill of the Pyeongchang air. She reached him just as his knees gave way, her small frame catching the coiled steel of his weight before he hit the cold floor. "Go," Du Kaiyang hissed, his voice a wrecked and low, dangerous vibration. Even as he bled, his stony and impassive mask attempted to regain its military precision. He tried to own the situation, his hand pushing feebly at her shoulder to force her toward the service exit. "The perimeter is compromised. Marcus is still out there. If you stay to help me, you are a disposable shadow in a suicide mission. Leave. Save your own unencumbered life." Niall didn't move. She ignored the mechanical precision of his order, her steel-gray eyes locking onto his with a lethal clarity that silenced his protests. She was no longer the girl who had run across the parking lot looking for a physical embrace of safety. She was the woman who had just dismantled an empire's attackers. "I am not a ghost anymore, Du Kaiyang," she whispered, her voice a steady resonance that cut through the heavy silence of the room. "I spent years being a disposable shadow for Marcus, and months being an invisible groundskeeper for you. I won't be a ghost in my own life just because you're too proud to admit you're hurting." She tore a strip from her groundskeeper uniform with a jagged vibration of fabric, her hands moving with a surgical focus she hadn't known she possessed. She pressed the cloth against the wound, her trembling fingers becoming warm and sure as she applied pressure. Du Kaiyang winced, his hard edges softening as he looked up at her through blurry eyes. He saw not a maid, but a miracle of quiet, breathtaking dignity who refused to be corrupted by this life of isolation. "You carry so much," he murmured, his voice rough and raw. "I thought I was the sovereign, but you are the one with the fortress of light. Why stay? I am just a broken stranger now." "Because love isn't a competition, and it isn't a hollow luxury you can buy," Niall replied, her voice soft and low as she continued to tend to him. "It's a choice you make every day. I chose to run into your arms tonight, but I'm choosing to stay because I want to see who you are when you aren't hiding behind a silent throne." The biting wind continued to howl outside, but inside the Museum of Isolation, a heavy, contemplative silence took root that was no longer built on secrets. Du Kaiyang stopped fighting her, his head resting against the cold marble as he finally allowed himself to be seen. They were two broken strangers in the dark, but as Niall held him, she realized that the shattering moment of the siege hadn't just broken the house. It had broken the cage, they had both been living in. The heavy silence that followed the departure of the caustic steam was not a peaceful one. It was the mechanical precision of a predator returning to his silent throne. Shim Du-kyung, though pale from the surgical necessary cut to his side, stood with a lethal clarity that made the air in the master wing feel heavy. He did not look like a man who had just been saved. He looked like a sovereign preparing for a surgical strike, but this time, he was not looking for a quick erasure. With Niall's help, he reached the primary terminal in his study, a grid of cold diamonds that hummed with material evidence of success. "You should look away, Niall," he rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that signaled the end of his vulnerability. But Niall didn't turn. She watched as his trembling fingers became warm and sure against the keys, moving with a military precision that was sudden and terrifying. He wasn't just calling for backup. He was performing a cold, calculated strategic exposure of every person who had breached his museum of isolation. Through the encrypted lines, Du-kyung bypassed the smart tech loops and initiated a surgical leak of the Seoul faction's hidden offshore ledgers and heavy secrets. Instead of attempting an unrealistic instant bankruptcy, he funneled the data directly to a third, more aggressive rival faction based in Incheon, men who had been looking for a reason to dismantle his current attackers for years. This surgical distraction was designed to keep the hit squad's leadership busy defending their own territories for months, ensuring they would be too preoccupied with an internal underworld war to ever look toward Pyeongchang again. The final surgical cut was reserved for Marcus Hale. Du-kyung didn't send men to find him in the biting, horizontal mist. Instead, he used his material evidence of Marcus's toxic dominance and illegal surveillance to leak incriminating files to a rival informant network, ensuring that Marcus would become a liability to his own handlers. It was a lethal and immovable end to Marcus's shadows, a shattering moment where the predator became the bait for even larger predators. However, as the amber glow of the screens faded, an icy distance began to grow in the room. Niall watched Du-kyung, seeing how easily he returned to the stony and impassive mask of the sovereign. The man who had choked gasps in her arms just minutes ago was gone, replaced by a silhouette of hard edges that viewed the world through cold calculations. The physical embrace they had shared in the dark was being replaced by the hollow luxury of his power. "It's done," Du-kyung said, his voice flat and unworthy of the intimacy they had shared. He didn't look at her. He looked at the concrete canyons of his monitors, his steel-gray eyes once again evaluating prey, even though the immediate war was over. Niall felt a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She realized that while Du-kyung had used his military precision to save her, the price of protection was seeing the monster he could be when he was operating in the shadows. The miracle of their connection felt like it was being corrupted by this life, the warmth of the bunker evaporating into a heavy, contemplative silence that felt like a shattering maze. "You protected me," she whispered, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence that felt out of place in the sterile room. "But you did it by becoming the very thing I ran from, a man who controls the world by turning people into targets." Du-kyung finally turned, his hard edges catching the light, but the icy distance remained. "I am a sovereign, Niall, to keep you safe now. I have to ensure my enemies are too busy fighting each other to remember your name." The shattering moment was complete. Niall looked at the fortress of light she had helped defend and realized it was still just a museum of isolation. The sovereign had returned to his silent throne, and the ghost was once again standing in the shadows, wondering if freedom was a nice fantasy she could never truly afford. The aftermath of the siege left the Pyeongchang estate in a state of heavy silence, a museum of isolation now cluttered with the material evidence of a war won through cold calculations. As the first light of dawn struggled through the biting, horizontal mist, Shim Du-kyung stood by the shattered floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite. He was once again the sovereign, his silhouette of hard edges draped in a fresh silk robe that cost more than Niall's monthly rent. Yet his steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the slushy intersections of the garden paths below. Niall stood near the door, her trembling fingers gripping the handle of a small suitcase, the only unencumbered possession she had left. Du Kaiyang turned, his stony and impassive mask momentarily softening as he looked at her. "The surgical exposure has worked, Niall," he rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that lacked its earlier lethal intensity. "The Soul faction is too busy defending their own ledgers to remember your name, and Marcus Hale is a disposable ghost in a federal holding cell. You are safe now, just as I promised." He stepped toward her, the hollow luxury of the room framing him like a silent throne. "Stay. I have already cleared your debts and established a fortress of light for you here. You will never have to be a disposable shadow or a workhorse again. You will have everything, the best treatment, the best life." Niall looked at him, and for a shattering moment, the nice fantasy of a life without constant survival mode nearly pulled her in. She thought about the physical embrace they had shared and the oolong tea truce in the bunker where he had looked like a broken stranger rather than a sovereign. But as she looked at his scarred knuckles and the cold metal of the world he inhabited, she realized that his price of protection was her own dignity. "You offered me a sanctuary, Du Kaiyang, but you built it out of shadows and heavy secrets," she said, her voice a steady resonance that cut through the heavy, contemplative silence. "You want to own my safety the same way you own this mountain, but love isn't a surgical contract, and it isn't a hollow luxury you can grant me." She looked at the concrete canyons of the estate one last time. "I don't want a fortress of light built by a sovereign. I want a life that is uncomplicated and entirely my own. I'm asking for my freedom." For the first time since they had met, the sovereign didn't argue. He didn't use military precision to command her or surgical cuts to undermine her resolve. He saw the lethal clarity in her eyes and recognized the miracle of her agency. He understood that to protect her now meant letting her go into a world where he couldn't evaluate the prey on her behalf. "Then go," he whispered, the rough and raw vulnerability of his voice revealing the bone-deep chill of his own isolation. "You walk away clean. No retaliation, no shadows following you." Niall nodded, a soaring sense of achievement warming her chest despite the biting wind. She turned and walked out of the Museum of Isolation, her footsteps steady on the slushy intersections of the drive. Du Kaiyang watched from the glass-walled balcony as her small figure disappeared into the white haze of the Pyeongchang snow. He was no longer isolated in the way he had been. He had been seen by a stranger and had remembered what hope feels like, but he was not yet redeemed. He remained the sovereign of a hollow empire, standing in the heavy silence, watching the only miracle he had ever known choose the price of freedom over the cage of his protection.